Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Alligator Podcast, where we talk all things at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and beyond. I'm your host, Elliot, and here's the news. Today here I have Christian Casale, who is a University Journal assignment reporter at the Alligator. Christian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Elliot. Good to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So I kind of wanted to talk about your article, which is entitled 20 Years Later, 9/11 Stirs Pain, Worry for Muslim Community. So I wanted to ask, what was your motivation to write this piece?
Well, I think the 20th anniversary has been on everyone's minds, especially after, the end of the US war in Afghanistan. So we were looking for a way to maybe do a different kind of spin on how we would interpret this anniversary. And we thought a really good way would be to look for people who saw 9/11 through a different perspective than most Americans who had a special stake in the game. And then we decided, we thought it would be really cool to get the perspective of Muslims who were on campus during 9/11 and what that must have been like for them. And then get the perspective of people who grew up Muslim in America after 9/11 and the implications of that, what they had to go through.
Right. And as I'm reading your article, it's you give a very detailed description of what happened with all four planes when two hit the both buildings of the World Trade Center. One hit the Pentagon, and the other United Flight 93, which was intended to hit the Capitol, but instead landed on Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And as I'm reading the article more, it's you kind of detail about the increased scrutiny of U.S. Muslim students repeatedly defending themselves in print. So I was just curious if you can kind of talk about that more.
Yeah, sure. I think, and to your first thing you said, when people heard about Pearl Harbor, in the 1940s, that's something they heard about on the radio or they read in the newspaper. This was all of America watched live on television as planes flew into buildings and people jumped out of buildings, and fire and devastation in New York. And that, it really contributes almost like a national wound or like a national traumatic episode. So I wanted to, and we all want to mourn in that moment. But if you're a Muslim in America at that moment, you have to do more than that. You feel like eyes on you. You can't just mourn with your fellow Americans. You have to mourn the way they want you to, or you have to constantly feel like I have to be mourning right. I have to say the right thing. I have to defend myself against, these people that don't speak for me or my religion. I have no relation to. So I thought that was, I just thought that was probably the key perspective of the story, because I just can't imagine that kind of craziness.
Right. Now, what was something that you found shocking when you were doing your research on this piece?
I don't know if anything is necessarily shocking, because these are things we heard about for 20 years, right? Like, we're all aware that, after 9/11, cab drivers in New York were beat in their cars, or that girls had their hijabs ripped off in schools. And what I thought was, interesting was the flip side of how the people talk about the support they got from the Gainesville community, from, interfaith organizations, from, people they didn't know. Women talk about guys who weren't Muslim offering to walk them to their cars, offering to always be there for emotional support. My professor at UF, Iman Zawahiri, sorry, I can repronounce that. Iman Zawahiri talked about how when a professor, didn't really give her emotional support or really understand her when she couldn't attend school right after 9/11, she was surprised because of all the support she was receiving from the rest of the Gainesville community.
Right, and you mentioned your article about more of her story. Can you give me like a quick summary of her side of the story?
Yeah, sure. So she was the president of Islam on campus, right, on 9/11, and you can imagine it's a real loaded position to be in. So, the way she characterized it to me, that she said that they had to organize in a proactive, protective, and defensive mode. They had to, have their backs to the wall as people, stared at them or questioned them or wanted explanations from these people who were Americans, just like them. And that was just like, I couldn't imagine having to go through that and this national trauma that was going on, and having to juggle all that your identity as an American, your identity as a Muslim in a hijab. And her parents were Egyptian, and the leader of the 9/11 hijackers was Egyptian. But she grew up in Panama City, Florida. So you have to, juggle all of these identities at the same time.
Right. And now she's a as I'm reading your article, she teaches media production and management technology at UF's College of Journalism and Communications. She's an award-winning filmmaker and serves as the director of the first ever American Muslim Film Grant. And that's amazing to think about. But it's I wanted to kind of continue in the piece that starts off with the quote. It all seemed to have been for nothing. Um, what does that quote mean, particularly?
Well, I think it especially for Sharif, who talked about more than anyone, kind of the feeling an identity as an American, during the attacks. I think he had a quote that said about patriotic sentiments turning into jingoistic ones about his minority group, and that his religion in a sense was hijacked, and he described it as being denigrated and desecrated, and believing in America, believing in being a land of opportunity, but then also having people doubt your allegiance to that country that you grew up in, that you love. So I think he talked about trying to live up to the ideals of America, but worrying that his progress being too slow, is everything for nothing, and about Muslims before 9/11 trying to portray themselves in a positive light, and then for it all to come literally, in a sense, crashing down.
Wafa Ateya mentioned in your article that she didn't remember the plane slamming to the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and the Pennsylvania field, and she was 4 years old. She vaguely remembers it, and I was wondering if you can talk more about her story as well, because it was something where the adults in the Gainesville Muslim community really endured.
Yeah, so yeah, Wafat grew up in Gainesville. Parents were Muslim. They were, I believe, one of her parents was an immigrant from Egypt, and she's 24 years old now. She's a doctorate student here at UF, so she's our age, and so she doesn't really remember it, just like we don't. But she, like the rest of us, she grew up in a post 9/11 world, and for some people that means other things. Excuse me, to us, that might mean something very different than someone who wears a hijab every day. So she remembers kind of the fear and the pain of the adults around her, in the years after. She would talk about how, people in her family, people in her community would talk about pre 9/11 days, like yearning for it. Like those were the days when you could wear, it feels comfortable wearing a hijab in public. Because that's really, and Sharif also touched on this, is that maybe there's no better symbol of someone being a Muslim in public than a hijab that a woman has to wear. So, sometimes it can take a lot of bravery, especially in the days after 9/11, to go out and do that.
So, of all your sources that you've interviewed, have they seen a change in Islamophobia? Like, has the amount of cases of that gone downhill, or has it stayed the same?
Well, in the days after 9/11, you can look at graphs nationally that Islamophobic hate crimes jumped to incredible levels right after 2001. And when I spoke to Professor Zawahiri, and this didn't make it into a story, but she had a theory, or she thought that after the election of President Trump, that there were a lot more positive portrayals of Muslims in media, in commercials, in popular culture, and that has contributed to a general shift as a reaction to some of the inflammatory Muslim politics that happened around 2015, 2016, culminated with the Muslim ban in 2017.
Right.
So she was very hopeful. Mr. Sharif was also hopeful, and all of them seem to think that, of course, now it's a lot better for Muslims, especially publicly, veiled ones. Much better to be a Muslim now. Actually, let me rephrase that. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
It's obviously much safer to be a Muslim publicly now than the days after 9/11.
Right.
And especially in a town like Gainesville, that tends to be a little bit liberal or progressive. But they still deal with microaggressions. They still deal with people being like, where are you really from? Or being surprised that they can speak English well, even though they're born and raised in Gainesville. And that's really, I think, what they characterize they have to deal with day to day, or just maybe the implicit bias of seeing a woman in a hijab and assuming she's quiet or she's kind of passive. And that's, that those are the daily struggles.
So kind of summarizing what you're saying is there was definitely a jump of Islamophobia right after 9/11 hit, but um, it took it took a while for it to kind of decrease. Now is that the best way to say that? What I
I
said?
would think so, but I think, you can't deny the tie that Arab and Islamic issues have had in American politics for the last 20 years. A couple of years after 9/11, we invade Iraq. That was a huge political issue. The first non-white president was characterized as an Arab and a Muslim by his detractors for 2 years, or for his entire life, or his entire political career. One of the key wedge issues in 2016 were Syrian refugees and whether we not should we allow them. People comparing Syrians trying to escape war to Skittles in a box. Of would you eat a box of Skittles if a couple of them were poisoned? So I don't think you can deny that there's still a lot of toxicity in the media climate around Muslims. But I don't think you can deny that the violent incidents of people deputizing themselves to protect America against a woman in a hijab or a guy that looks kind of foreign, I think that has gone down.
Gotcha. Okay. And my last question for you is, what's the biggest takeaway that people can get from this article that you've published?
Oh, talk to Muslims. Like, talk to people that you don't know about, and you'll very quickly find that any assumptions you have or any opinions will kind of melt away. And that's what's uncomfortable, to a sense of doing this interview, because I have to speak for them. When I think this article I wrote, I really tried to let them tell their own story and put in their own piece and really set the scene for what it was like to be a Muslim American at 9/11. That's something that most people just cannot fathom. And when you don't understand something like that, it's easy to just kind of wave it off, or it's easy to just say, oh, you're being dramatic, or it doesn't really matter that much. It does, and it matters to these people a lot. It really impacted their lives. So, we say we all live in a post 9/11 world. We all do, but they really do.
Well, Christian, thanks so much for joining us for the Alligator podcast. And now, if any viewers want to check out the article, it's entitled 20 Years Later, 9/11 Stirs Pain, Worry for Muslim Community, and you can find it on the Alligator website. Thanks, Christian, for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Well, that's all for today. Be sure to follow us on your favorite listening and viewing platform, as well as checking out new episodes Mondays and Fridays. Thank you for listening. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day.